What's up, guys? Today I want to give you the top 3 tips so you can get the best shoulder position in your handstand. Nah, that's a lie. That's all bullshit. But I do want to talk about handstand shoulder position because it can get a bit complicated. It's easy to oversimplify, which isn't a bad thing, but I do want to discuss just some of the specifics and some of the possibilities so that you can think about it maybe in a different way, because I know I went through certain phases when I believed that a certain technique was what I had to do, and it wasn't until I kind of went outside that and experimented with it that my practice started to shoot up. So first we have to talk about a few, I guess, not only terminology, but a few of the potential variables in the shoulder position, just so you understand that it's more complicated than just pushing, even though that's still a good cue, and I'll talk about that. So, first one is the shoulder angle. That's going to refer to the angle of the arms in relation to the back. And generally we're going to be either opening or closing the shoulder angle. So if I open my shoulder angle, that refers to shoulder flexion. Closing the shoulder angle refers to shoulder extension. Next, we're going to have the spinal flexion extension, which also technically it's not shoulder positioning, but it does play a pretty big role. So we have spinal extension, spinal flexion, and that might be cued as ribs. So that might be cued as ribs out versus ribs in. We have elevation and depression, which is also, so that's going to be scapular movement. That's also a really important part of what you're going to do with your shoulders in the handstand. So elevation would be pressing the shoulders up towards the head, and the handstand pushing into the floor, or pulling down would be depression. We have protraction, retraction, right? So protraction, we're going to pull the shoulder blades apart around the back. Retraction, we're going to be pressing them back together. So, and then we have rotation, that's the last one. So internal rotation is going to go this way, external rotation goes this way. So like I said, all of those are factors in the handstand shoulder position. And if you followed my teaching for a long time, you know that I don't believe that there's one way to do something. I believe that everyone's going to find their own way, and until you experiment to find your own way, you won't really have an understanding of what's happening. But just keep understanding all those factors, because they're all going to play into what's going to be happening in the handstand. So this is something I'm going to repeat. The best thing that you can do to get the most stable shoulder position in your handstand is to find comfort. If it hurts, you're probably not comfortable. If you have to work too hard, you're probably not comfortable. So if you can be comfortable in a handstand, you can rest in a handstand. I wouldn't worry too much about all these details until you get more advanced, because if you can be comfortable and still hold the position, you're probably doing a good job. But let's talk about some of these specifics. So first of all, the shoulder angle. So generally, the cue is going to be to open the shoulders. So ideally we want something like 180 degrees. We want a straight line between the back and the shoulders, because that allows our bone structure to hold us up, and that allows an easier transition into thinking of the handstand as a resting position where we rest on the bones instead of using the muscle to press ourselves up. So the general cue is going to be opening the shoulders. And for a lot of people, that's a good cue, because shoulder flexibility can be a major factor. So people who have trouble opening their shoulders either can't get their arms back, or they have to go into the spinal extension to do so. So opening shoulders, yes, to a point. Because for a lot of people, they do need to work more on their shoulder flexibility. They need to do work more on opening so they can have a straighter line. But then there are people who are going to be hypermobile who can open their shoulders too far. So in this case, opening the shoulders isn't always a good cue, because if you open too far, now you're past 180 degrees, which is generally not a good thing for stability unless you're specifically working Mexican handstand, which is a different skill. So with opening the shoulders, keep that in mind. But generally, you do want an open shoulder angle. Generally, you want close to a straight line between the arms and the back. One variable that's going to make it look weird is maybe people's elbow shape. So just think of a straight line going from the heel of the hand to the middle of the deltoid, and then from that, just with the angle of the back. So that's one. Generally, you want open shoulders. Somebody who's hypermobile, I would actually cue, and I would argue that it's safer to not be fully open, but to actually be slightly closed, because to be fully open when you can't support the weight there yet can also be dangerous, can be injury risk. So if you have to question it, I would say slightly closed angle is better than too open. So that's going to be number one. Elevation versus depression. This is really important as well. The general cue is going to be to push, and you kind of do want that. Generally in a handstand, you don't want to be sunken because then you're resting too much on your connective tissue. So I like to think to have a certain amount of push upwards so that there's some sort of a buffer there. One way I've heard it described by Mikhail Christensen was like, it's like an extra life, right? It's like you're playing Mario and you get the mushroom that makes you big, so if you fall, you still have this to catch yourself, but if you're already here, it's generally not as stable, and generally you don't have something to catch yourself when you fall. So generally you want open shoulders, generally you want shoulder elevation, and now again, this is one of those where you don't necessarily need to go to the maximum to get the stability you need. So for a while, I was really in that school of thought where I thought, okay, you have to go maximum push all the time. And I realized that my shoulders actually work a lot better in terms of stability when I'm not all the way up, but kind of somewhere in the middle. I'm definitely not all the way sunken. I have some amount of push, but that amount of push is what I need to be comfortable, and it's not 100%. And this is where it can get confusing because the standard cue is going to be push up, push tall, arms to ears. I actually really don't like the arms to ears cue because it allows for some random mistakes. So I think the language of that cue isn't very good because it allows for artistic interpretation to be done wrong potentially. But this idea, so you do want shoulder elevation, but how much is up to you. And it also depends on the skill. So if I'm just holding a basic stacked handstand, I don't necessarily have to be pushing too much. But if I'm doing a press handstand, my legs, they get heavier when they go lower than the horizontal. So then I have to push up more to maintain the position. Same thing if we're going one arm. Just to maintain the same position, I have to push twice as hard. So it's not a bad idea to think about pushing and elevating up more during those skills. Same thing when it comes to beginners. Generally, because gravity is pushing them this way, the tendency is going to be to sink this way. So it's a generally good cue to think of pushing up and elevating. Just keep in mind to the point that once you get a little bit more intermediate advanced, you don't necessarily have to be all the way elevated, but you definitely don't want to be in depression. You definitely don't want to be sunken unless you're working specific movements like planche transition, handstand push-up, but that's when the position changes, right? So we're no longer in that overhead position. So keeping that in mind as far as elevation depression, it's spinal flexion extension. So this relates to shoulder opening and closing and elevation as well. So kind of all three of them are connected. Generally, right, for the classic handstand line, you want a flat back. But everybody's back is shaped differently. Some people backs really prioritize extension, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. And again, some people extend their back in a handstand because they're unable to open their shoulders as much as they want, and that's their body compensating for it, which it's not necessarily a bad thing when I say compensation. It's actually the body being very clever. Some people take it very far and they go, so I like a flat back. Yeah, within reason, within the general shape of your body. Some people take it, to me, it's too far. I personally don't like the look of this, but again, it's one of those things. If it's comfortable for you, if you like the way it looks and the way it feels, don't let me tell you that I don't like to do it. I mean, let me tell you that, but you don't have to listen. So, right, another option, some people go really far. So basically they round their back past a flat back to where they're rounded, and in that case, to maintain the vertical line, they have to open and push with the shoulders even more. To me, it's kind of exaggerated, and I don't find that position comfortable. I get my shoulders where they need to go. Open, generally I like to be maybe a little bit closed shoulder because I do have hypermobility in the shoulders, and for me it's not, I don't like to be too open because I know when my shoulders start to feel sketchy. And I try to think ribs in because ribs in flattens the back. But again, it's within a level of comfort. You don't need to have a completely flat back to be able to do a lot of these advanced handstand variations. What you need to conserve and understand is that you want a vertical line from the floor through your arms and through the main points of your body, in this case your hip. You can have a slightly arched back and be slightly out of line with that part of the body as long as we have the hand, shoulder, and hip on the vertical line. But let's try to not to get too complex with this. Basically, you want to think ribs in. You want to think the best cue is going to be it's a slight spinal flexion from your neutral position. This, and that's going to act in conjunction with the shoulder opening and with the shoulder elevation to create a better stack so that you can use your bones to hold yourself up. Protraction, retraction. So generally, and this kind of goes for most pushing movements in general, we generally want protraction. Like I said, we're trying to get the body to stack, so we're trying to get the bone structure to hold itself up. The scapula are not attached to anything, they're floating. So if they're retracted, it's going to be much more difficult to find that resting position, to find that mechanical advantage that we can use our body for. So general suggestion for me is to be protracted. Again, the protraction generally correlates to that hollowing of the chest, the rounding of the back. Just keep this in mind as well, and you can play with it vertical. So this is me in an overhead position, and I'm retracting my shoulder blades, and now we're actually getting into rotation as well, which is the last thing I want to talk about. So when I retract, my shoulders want to internally rotate. But when I retract, it takes the scapula off the body rather than connecting them, so it's very difficult to stay in one piece and to have that stack. So general thought for handstand is going to be protracted. It doesn't have to be anything crazy round like I had in my planche video. It's just making sure that the scapula are attached to the back. So because it's really difficult to coordinate protraction, retraction in the overhead position, usually that ribs in cue, that slight rounding or hollowing of the chest is what's going to help account for that. So yeah, general thought for handstand, protraction. Okay, and then last we have shoulder rotation. So this one's interesting because I like to think of it as a neutral rotation. I like to think of it as not really either externally or internally rotated. So generally with the handstand, I teach either index or middle finger facing forward. So in that case, if we have, let's say, the index finger facing up, and I take my arms in an overhead position, I should be able to maintain the ribs in, the shoulder protraction, enough elevation. It's something to practice. What ends up happening, and this is where it correlates now with the retraction and with the shoulder opening. So sometimes when people try to open their shoulders too far past where their body allows, then it starts to go into an internal rotation, and that internal rotation also leads to a scapular retraction, and then the position kind of gets to be less stable, for lack of a better word. So this is what I like to think, and you can do with a stick as well, but good exercise. You can either do thumbs pointing up or index finger because that's going to correlate to the floor handstand. Maintain the same position without flaring the ribs, without bending the elbows. See how far. You can add an extra push if you want, seeing how far you can get your arms up. But like I said, this is what happens when people try to open their shoulders too far, is they start to rotate in, as if I was doing like a stick dislocate. I would internally rotate to get my shoulders further back, right? They start to do this in their handstand, and then their elbows start to go in different directions, their fingers start to go in. And again, there are certain specific techniques that use that and that allow for it, but in this case, we're talking about just finding a resting position for your basic handstand. So with that idea, we don't want the internal rotation. We want to keep it neutral. And now why do I say neutral? Because external rotation is something that I'm going to do when I go the other way. So if I go shoulders closed, then what's going to happen is naturally I'm going to start to engage the lats. I'm going to start to depress the shoulders, and at the same time, that's when I'm going to go into my rotation, because when I'm doing something like a planche, something like a handstand push-up, basically a skill that involves a closed shoulder angle rather than an open shoulder angle, I'm going to use that musculature to help me out. So neutral position, resting, up and down. If I go open, it starts to internally rotate. If I go closed, it starts to externally rotate. All right, see where the hands go. So planche, handstand push-up, whatever other skills go into there. Not so much press handstand, because that kind of follows a different law. So why don't I cue, a lot of people cue external rotation as a way to generally find shoulder position, especially with weightlifting and stuff like that. Why don't I cue shoulder rotation in the external range? Because a couple different things, and again, this is just what I found from my personal experience. It tends to encourage a mini planche, right? Because when I do this, my shoulders want to close, and when the shoulders want to close, the body goes like this. If you're not familiar with the mini planche, you have to go back in my YouTube videos. I have a video on it. It's a really common kind of beginner, sometimes advanced mistake that people make, is they don't respect the vertical line in their handstand. But the reason that I don't cue external rotation is because it makes people sink, and it makes people lean forward, and it makes people go too much into their muscular effort rather than trying to respect and maintain this idea of the resting position. The other thing that tends to happen sometimes when we go external rotation is the weight becomes shifted to this bone of the hand, and again, for somebody maybe learning to find their handstand position, we want to spread the weight out more evenly throughout the whole hand to get more surface area. So a lot of times people with, sometimes it's a wrist flexibility issue, sometimes it's an elbow issue, sometimes it's shoulder placement, sometimes it's that rotation, but it's going to put the weight on this part of the hand rather than displacing it more evenly throughout. More even displacement of the weight is going to give you better control of your balance. So yeah, it's getting complicated. You can see how it's not just about chest in, push tall, although those are generally good cues for people. So hopefully, I don't know if I answered any questions. You probably have more questions now, but just to understand some of the factors that go into the shoulder positioning of the handstand. So as far as a general resolution, because we should make one, here are some of the best, again, general things to think about, and this applies to a straight handstand. If we're starting to go banana back or contortion handstand, those follow a little bit of different rules and principles. So basically we want shoulder opening to a point, depending on how flexible and loose you are in your shoulders. But let's say that we want shoulder opening, we want shoulder elevation. Again, more isn't necessarily better, but better to think more elevation than less elevation, because gravity is pushing you the other way. We want protraction because we want the shoulder blades to be attached to the back and attached to the body so that we can continue to use our skeletal structure to hold ourselves up. We want the back to be in, let's call it slight spinal flexion. I still would think of it as neutral, but because the natural tendency is going to be to extend, I think it's better to name it and to call it just a slight intention of spinal flexion. And then neutral rotation, so neither external nor internal, neutral. And then this way, there's more variables of course, but this way we can start to find and understand these factors that allow us to have a resting position in the handstand. And I talk about this a lot. I'm going to continue talking about this more. The handstand is not a strength move. It's something that should be as easy as standing. It's not, of course, it's a lot harder, so we have to find ways that respect the mechanical advantage our body gives us. When we can have a resting position in a handstand, that's when our practice can start to go up several levels, because we're not wasting energy on doing stupid shit like holding ourselves up. So anyway, I hope this video is helpful. If you want to learn from me in person, this is the best option. So check out my upcoming workshops below on my website. Just launched my online training group, the Physical Philosophy Project. So that's going to delve into different topics and different themes with support. I offer online coaching now. Yeah, all of that. Let me know what else you'd like to see. I'll put out YouTube videos whenever. Sometimes once a week, sometimes once a month. I don't know. Make sure you follow my social media. Like, share, subscribe. Yeah, that's all I have. Later.